All right, welcome everyone to Strategic Conversations for Leadership and Major Gifts. This is Laurel McComb, Senior Philanthropy Advisor for the Osborne Group. I want to thank you all for joining me today for this webinar. And just a couple of housekeeping items. You should all see a Q&A box or icon at any time during the webinar. Please feel free to submit a question. I'm going to stop a couple of times to answer questions, and if for some reason I don't get to your question today, I will collect them all from the webinar and I'll respond to you directly if I don't have a chance to answer it during the webinar, but please feel free to submit those questions. Also, just to let you know, I am going to be mentioning a few resources today during the call. If you are interested in getting any of those resources or a PDF of the slides from today, please email me after the webinar today. I'm going to be sharing my email with you at the end of the webinar. Go ahead and just send me an email and I will send you those resources and the slides, whatever you are most interested in. So again, welcome. Strategic Conversations. This is a really exciting topic because I think it's something that we don't talk enough about in the nonprofit sector. We talk a lot about being donor-centric and we talk about relationship building, but we don't always get into the nitty-gritty of what does it really look like and what does it really mean for us to be building effective relationships with people, and how do we do that? And one of the ways that we do that is through having strategic conversations. So we're gonna get into that today, obviously. So what are we really trying to achieve? We talk about this a lot with the Osborne Group in terms of what we're really trying to achieve. And, you know, I get it that day to day, a lot of times it feels like what we're trying to achieve is the bottom line, right? For a lot of us, it feels like what we're after is just hitting our revenue numbers and hitting those projections and making sure we keep the lights on, right? And that's a totally valid thing to feel like is our goal. But I want to flip that a little bit and think about our real goal. Because in order to be sustainable, in order to grow, in order for us to not be worrying as much about hitting those revenue numbers, we need to be creating inspired, joyful, generous investors. This is what it's about, because we know that donors who feel more connected to our impact and our outcomes are more satisfied with us, and donors who are more satisfied, in turn, continue to give to our organizations and hopefully give more to our organizations, leading to greater sustainability, leading to more opportunities for growth. So ultimately what we're trying to do is not just kind of twist people's arms into giving us the money we need to meet our bottom line, but what we're really trying to do is inspire people, bring people the joy of giving, the joy of philanthropy to our organizations so that they want to continue to give. I heard this quote once and I love it, that our goal is that we should want our donors to say about us that I give to your organization because it is a catalyst for everything I believe in. You know, so often I think we feel like we're twisting people's arms to give to us when really we are in a really exciting role to help people fulfill their own dreams, right? There are people out there who everyone has a social agenda, everyone has a social portfolio, and we are part of helping them enact that portfolio, and it's a really exciting role, and it's a really exciting thing for us to do. We just have to remember that that's what we're trying to do, that we're not, you know, guilting people into giving, but we're helping them fulfill, you know, dreams that they have for this world and their communities. But in order for us to do that, we have to start to shift culture. This can't just be about business as usual. And as we think about having strategic conversations, I think it's really important for us to remember why we're doing it. Again, inspiring, joyful, and generous investors, and then how we're going to do it. And this isn't just about changing the way we do things, but this is really about how we change the way we think about philanthropy in our organizations and our culture of philanthropy. And, you know, so take a look at this slide. This is a slide that I use a lot because I think it's important for us to always be reminding ourselves where we're coming from and where we're headed, and always be working toward getting to that right? Getting to that two box, and how do we make sure that we're always progressing? And when we specifically apply this shifting culture to having strategic conversations, I think we start to realize some of the things that maybe we've done in the past and how we want to make those changes. So how do we shift from being fragmented, having kind of ad hoc off-the-cuff conversations that aren't necessarily leading to anything, to having more strategic and integrated conversations? How do we move away from being transaction-based to being more relationship-based? How do we move away from episodic contact, episodic opportunities for engagement, to being more donor-centered and really thinking about how does this apply from the donor's point of view, putting ourselves in their shoes and thinking about, how do I want to be engaged in this organization? How do I want people to talk to me? What do I want this organization to know about me so that I can have a better donor experience? So think about some of the ways that your organization currently engages donors, has conversations with donors, and think about what it would look like for you to move to some of these other more advantageous, more effective ways of being donor-centric, including your donors in conversations, and just approaching philanthropy in general. Any of you who've been on in just about any Osborne Group training will probably have seen the Turnpike curve of involvement at some point. This is a slide that all of us at the Osborne Group really love to use, and there's a reason we love to use it, and it's because it is really effective. It is, I'm a very visual person, and for me, even though this seems like a relatively obvious equation, I think it helps me to visualize it. So I love using the Turnpike curve when I'm thinking about building donor relationships, because it helps me think about, where are my donors, where are my prospects currently, and where do I want them to be? Because obviously, as we can see in this graph, as involvement increases, so does giving. Of course, it doesn't increase much until we get to engagement. That's really kind of the key point, is moving past awareness, moving past interest, and hitting that engagement point is really where giving starts to take off. So, if I were a development professional in my office, I would have a giant Turnpike curve taped to my wall, and I would have Post-its with all of my key prospects posted along this curve. Where are they today, with an idea of, within the next 3 to 6 to 9 to 12 months, where do I want them to be on this curve? And always trying to make sure that I'm moving them along, that I'm being strategic. And we're going to talk a little bit later about that planning process and how we really start to create some plans that move people along. And how are we using conversations to really move this relationship along? So I want you to keep this Turnpike curve of involvement in your mind as we talk about having strategic conversations, and as we think about building those conversations with a purpose, right? And the purpose ultimately is moving people along this continuum from awareness to taking personal responsibility, and ultimately remembering our first ultimate goal that we talked about just a couple of slides ago, which is building joyful, generous investors. This is the continuum that we're moving our donors toward being those joyful, generous investors, and we want to make sure that we're being really, really intentional about that. A lot of people, when we start to think about how do we start to engage people in our organizations, how do we start to get people involved, throughout my career and throughout my time working with nonprofit organizations, I have had many people ask me, well, Laurel, can you help us write an elevator speech? We just need our board members and our staff. They just need that, business card size, elevator speech that they can stick in their wallet and pull out, whenever they meet somebody who might be interested in the organization, so that they can tell them how great we are and tell them all the important things about us. And as the very, very wise Seth Godin said, as you can see here, the reality is that no one ever bought anything on an elevator. Elevator speeches have been, for a very long time, kind of a standard in communications in the nonprofit organization and in the for-profit sector as well. But the reality is that being armed with a whole bunch of information about our organizations is not necessarily the best way to engage people with our organization and with what we're doing, because it's not just about telling people how great we are, right? It's as much about engaging people. So we have to get away from this idea of selling ourselves, which is really what an elevator speech is kind of grounded in, right? We spend so much time on, making brochures and building slide decks and doing elevator speeches. And yes, we have to do those things because we have to make presentations and, you know, all of those things. But whenever we are going to be communicating with potential donors, community members, potential volunteers, anyone out there who are trying to engage and bring into our philanthropic family, we need to be thinking about how do we stop selling our organization and how do we start. My colleague Bob Osborne always talks about it. I love the term that, you know, that nonprofit is not a meritocracy, right? So that it's not about, we would all love to think that if we just prove to people why we're the best, that we should be able to get the money, right? And even in grants, even in foundation world, we think that it's more true in foundations than anywhere else. We write the best grant proposals, we have best outcome data, or we have, you know, if we can just prove that we are the best, that we have the greatest merit, that we should get the most money. And the reality is that's just not how the work.
I think I lost you all right here about selling versus engaging, and I kind of kept talking until suddenly all of you were like, hey, I can't hear you. So here I am, I'm back. Talking about selling versus engaging, and the reality is, you know, it's not just about us trying to convince people how great we are, no matter how we could talk till we're blue in the face. And you know, there's a lot of competition out there. There's a lot of other nonprofits who have really good things to say about themselves too. This isn't just about trying to convince people that we are amazing, because you are amazing. Every single person on this phone is doing amazing things, but it's really about engaging them in our work. And to do that, it has to be two-way engagement. For engagement to really be effective, we have to be able to, it has to be interactive. It can't just be something that we, you know, it's not just a newsletter. Newsletters are good, they have their place, but if we're really trying to do two-way engagement, it has to be something that's interactive. It has to be meaningful and satisfying for the donor, and it has to be productive for us. So, you know, a lot of times we come up with volunteer opportunities for our potential donors, and a lot of times there are things that maybe aren't the highest on our priority list. They aren't the things that are most important to the organization, and maybe aren't even that helpful to us, but we're kind of just like, oh, we just need to get them to do something so that we're engaging them, right? And when people are given busy work, they know that they're given busy work, and so we have to make sure that the ways that we're engaging people are meaningful and satisfying and productive for us. Let people know that the input they're having, the conversations you're having, the volunteer opportunities you're providing are things that are really helpful to you, and people are going to be far more excited about that. Another really wise man, Tom Ahern, who hopefully all of you know and listen to his webinars and see him speak, because he's pretty amazing. He said this, you know, you're not information vendors, you're emotion vendors, and you can sell that at a higher price for longer, for more. And you know, what's really what gets me most about this quote is the fact that he says that, you know, I'll only pay attention to what interests me, and what interests me most is me. Ask anyone, right? You know, this is what, you know, we forget when we're going out and we're talking to people, is that as wonderful as your organizations are, which they are, no doubt, as wonderful as you are, the people you're talking to are still most interested in themselves. And that doesn't mean to say that people are egocentric, but that's just the reality, right? All of us care most about ourselves. And so we have to remember that when we're engaging people, again, this isn't just about us. This isn't just about convincing people how great we are, but we really have to engage them. So how do we do that? How do we know what it is that is important to people, and how do we move this from being a selling conversation to being an engaging conversation? How do we make sure that this is a conversation that's being built around the donor? You know, we talk again, you know, I mentioned this before, we talk so much about being donor centric. It's such a big word in our industry right now. But the reality is, we talk a lot about it, but we don't really in our day-to-day work really think about it, really implement it, or make decisions based on being donor-centric. And one of the ways we can change that, one of the ways we can start to move toward being donor-centric, is putting systems and processes in place that force us to be donor-centric. And one of the things that we really love is the donor puzzle, which you see in front of you. I, as a kid, always really loved anything detective. I loved Nancy Drew and Agatha Christie, and I really wanted to be in the FBI, and my mom actually even sent me to detective camp. There was a day camp that I went to when I was 10 years old, just all about becoming a detective. And it was always something, and even to this day, you know, Poirot is one of my favorite shows, and I love mysteries. And I always thought that even though I didn't go into the FBI and I didn't become a private detective, that in some ways going into development allowed me to continue to be a detective to some extent. And the donor puzzle, I think, is really the thing that demonstrates that for me, because this is where we are putting the pieces together to solve the mystery of our donors and solve the mystery of our prospects. You know, we use the donor puzzle to look at all of the key pieces of information that we want to know about our donors, and we start to build this picture of who they are and how they best connect to our organization. So these are the, you'll see on your screen now, these are the pieces of the donor puzzle. You know, we want to know things like capacity, inclination, you know, motivation is a really big piece of this. What motivates our donors? What kind of values do they have? Who else do they give to? Who are their decision-making partners? How do they want to be engaged? All of these different things that to move people along that Tarnside curve, to really start to have joyful, generous investors, we have to know these things. Solving the donor puzzle is probably one of the most important things we can do to better engage our donors, improve our donor relationships, and ultimately raise more money. Again, getting to that bottom line. So paying attention to the donor puzzle, and I'm going to show you an excerpt in a little bit from our engagement strategy worksheet. If any of you are interested in getting a copy of that engagement strategy worksheet, you can email me after the webinar today, and that actually has all of these pieces of the donor puzzle built into it, so that as you're making your donor plans, as you're building those strategies out, you can start to fill in each of these puzzle pieces and start to know, what do I know about people, what do I not know, how am I going to find out about these things as we're starting to build those relationships with others. So ultimately, to solve the donor puzzle, right? Because if we go back and we look at all of these different things, you know, think about, you know, for a minute, picture in your mind, you know, your top prospects, or one of your top prospects, one of those people who you're really actively, maybe you have a 3 to 6 month plan on them for a leadership or a major gift, and think about what pieces of the donor puzzle you know right now you have solved, and then think about which pieces of the donor puzzle you don't have solved. I think, you know, how do we solve the donor puzzle? And so much of that is about strategic conversations. So again, it's about us sharing information about the organization, but also getting information from them and finding out where we meet in the middle. You know, again, think about that first date analogy, and you think about the best first dates are when you learn something about the person you're with, you share some information, and suddenly you start to find all of these places where you intersect, right? The times when you think about the times with a donor or in your personal life when you've really connected with somebody, and it's because you have found out things about each other equally, and then found places where your interests, your motivations, your values intersect. You know, as you can see here, it's the good stuff, right? That place where you cross over. That's when you really start to build that engagement. That's really when you start to grow your relationship with someone. I'm going to pause now. I know that most of the questions so far have just been about my my audio, but I'm going to see if we have any other questions. It doesn't look like we have any other questions right now. I just remind you, if you have any questions, please submit them via the Q&A box, and I will answer them as we go along. But I'm going to pause for a minute and take a little poll. So I'm going to launch this poll, and I want to hear from all of you. When you think about your greatest challenge when you're having strategic conversations, what's your biggest challenge? Is it having an end goal? You know, why am I even having this conversation? Is it knowing what questions to ask, right? So how do I, if I'm trying to solve the donor puzzle, what questions do I even ask to solve that? Is it not having time, not taking the time ahead of your meetings and ahead of your conversations to really plan and strategize what you're going to do? Or is it on the back end of your conversations, not recording what you learn and following up effectively? So take a minute and vote. I'm going to give everybody just a couple more seconds, about 5 more seconds to vote. 3, 2, oh, looks like we still have some people. Just a few more seconds. Still a lot of activity, people voting. All right, looks like we've got most people in. So I'm gonna end the poll. I'm gonna share the results with you. So as you can see, and this actually comes up a lot when we talk about strategic conversations, is just knowing what questions to ask. And I'm actually going to reiterate this in just a minute, but one of the tools that I am very happy to share with any of you after this webinar is a resource we have that's just called Strategic Questions, and it is just pages and pages of questions, and we've actually grouped them around the donor puzzle so that as you're thinking about those different puzzle pieces and you're trying to figure out, if gosh, I really need to learn more about their values, or I really need to learn more about the other decision makers that they have, we actually have given you some sample questions that you can ask and have in your back pocket. I'm going to talk about that again, but just for those of you who are keeping notes on what you want to get in touch with me about after this, that's another really great resource that I'm very happy to share with you. So back to this. So, as we really get into strategic conversations and we think about what needs to happen as we're having these conversations with people, I think it's important that we think about and we plan for having those conversations. And the first and foremost rule, and this is something that, I hope all of you becomes a mantra for all of you, because I know it's a mantra for me, is that every engagement, every conversation, every telephone call, every time that we engage with a donor or a potential donor, that engagement must do 2 things. It must increase motivation and it must decrease objection. So again, if you're sitting at your desk at home, I want you to repeat out loud with me now, every engagement must increase motivation, decrease objection. So as you're planning for those engagements, think about those 2 things. Now, increasing motivation is kind of an obvious one. I think most of us plan for that. I think most of us think about that. When we are getting ready to talk to somebody, this is what we're really good at in the nonprofit sector, is increasing motivation, because we're very good at pulling together information about the organization, pulling together statistics, pulling stories together, finding ways to talk to donors and potential donors about why we're really great. This is something that we're actually really good at. I think what I encourage you to do when you're thinking about pulling together that information, again, is revisit that donor puzzle and think about, what is it that I don't know, or what is it that I want to make sure that any gaps that they might have, that we're increasing motivations in the right directions. If you know that they really love certain programs that you offer, or if they have a particular interest within your organization, make sure that those are the examples you're sharing, right? If they've not expressed any interest in a certain program, don't lead with that, right? Lead with the things that you know that they're most interested in, that they're most excited about. Now, decreasing objections is the thing that we're not as good at, because decreasing objections means that we actually have to admit that there are objections, right? And that's not always the easiest thing for us to do. It's not always easy for us to kind of pause and think about, what challenges might this donor or potential donor have with the organization? And, objections aren't always like terrible things. When we say objections, it's not that your potential donors are sitting at home, terrified of something that's going on at your organization. Oftentimes, objections are the smallest little twinges that people might have in the back of their mind, or questions that just haven't yet been answered by the organization. Sometimes it's as simple as, gosh, I've never met any of your board members. I would love to meet one of your board members and hear more about the board. And again, that's not a glaring objection, but it's a gap in their understanding of the organization. And it might be something that's keeping them from making that big gift, making that big commitment to you. So again, think about the dating analogy. As you think about, the ultimate, getting ready to get married and all of those little things that, it may not be that you have a huge objection, I hate your parents, or, whatever it might be, but there might be small things that you just haven't talked about yet. Maybe, oh gosh, are we going to combine our bank account? Things like that. So as you think about, again, going back to the donor puzzle, when you go through the donor puzzle, think both about how do we increase their motivation around these things, but also, do we know of any objections that they have? And we're going to talk in a minute about listening. Listening is going to be our biggest, greatest tool to finding objections, because a lot of times people are telling us where they're having challenges or questions they have, or lingering concerns that they might have. We just don't always listen to it. So, part of understanding objections is really listening to people when they're sharing with us or asking us questions about the organization. So again, your mantra every time you're getting ready to have a donor meeting, have a conversation with a potential donor, is that you must, within that conversation, increase motivation and decrease objection. There's a few other things that we want to make sure that you're doing in all of your conversations. First, we want to make sure that you always have a think message in your conversations with donors. And when we talk about think is really, think messages are really about, those things that you can, information that you can provide. And again, oftentimes these are the things that are increasing motivation or decreasing objections. So, how can we share with them some information about our financial management? Have we not really given them a lot of information about the impact of their gift? Is there a issue with trust? And again, it looks like I'm so sorry, everyone, that seem to be having so many technical difficulties. Somebody just said that the screen is blank. Do you all see the screen now? It should say think on it. Yes. Okay, it's back. Sorry again, everyone, for all of these technical difficulties. I promise that the next time you join me on a webinar, I will have all of these kinks worked out with this new system. I really, really apologize. So again, having a lack of in-depth organizational knowledge, anything that we can do to make sure that people have the information that they need. So, and then again, feel. So the next thing, so we want to make sure we have a think message, and we also want to make sure that we have a feel message, right? Because, this is that, everyone lives on this spectrum. If you think about a spectrum that goes from thinking to feeling, right? Everyone lives somewhere on that spectrum. You think about, there are some people in your life, that are all think. I always think about, that are all in their heads. You think about board members, especially. I always think board members really fit along this spectrum. That there are some people who just want, give me facts, give me figures, tell me, just give me the information. That's how I'm going to make a decision. Where other people are all about feel. They're all about, I don't care about facts and figures, just make me feel something. Tell me a story, make me cry, really, really make me feel the impact of the organization. And what we have to do, because everyone lives on this spectrum, right? Most people are somewhere in the middle between think and feel, right? And so what we have to do, because everyone's kind of all over the place, we have to make sure that we always have both of those messages, that we always have a think message and we always have feel messages. So feel messages are really those things. They're stories. They're ways that help people live the impact in a more personal way, right? So it's not just, hearing about how the organization is doing really great things, but this is where we really have some opportunities to show, especially existing donors, through stewardship, show existing donors how they are the superhero of our story, right? How they are helping to make sure that all of this is working effectively, is having great impact, and making them feel really excited. This is, we go back to that Tom Ahern quote, and we talk about, the thing that I'm most interested is me, right? So great to hear about the organization, but what I really want to hear about is how I'm helping the organization, how I'm helping make an impact in the lives of people, not necessarily how the organization is having impact on people, but how I, the donor, am having impact on people. So we want to make sure that we have those feel messages. So we have think messages, we have feel messages, and then ultimately we have do messages, right? So our do messages are going to get people to do something, right? Because it's all well and good to give people information and to make them feel something, but if we don't get them to act, if we don't get them to do something, then we've dropped the ball a little bit, because ultimately engagement is really about getting people to do things. When we think about the Turnpike curve and you think about awareness and interest, right? Those first two steps, a lot of that is about thinking and feeling. That's about how do we get information out, how do we tell stories. But when we get to engagement, that point at which giving really takes an upturn, that's really about getting people to do something. So every time we have a conversation, every time we engage with a donor, we have to make sure that we have some kind of do message, that we're ending our meetings, that we're ending our conversations with some kind of request that gets them to say yes to a next step. Now, this is, some of you have heard me talk about this, but this is what I like to call the sweater in the car routine, right? So you go on a date with someone and the date goes really well, but you're not quite sure, you think it went well, you seem to get along, you definitely want to see this person again, but you're not quite sure, how to go about that. So maybe you accidentally leave your sweater in the car, right? And so now you have a reason the next day to call and say, oh my gosh, I left my sweater in your car. Maybe we should meet for coffee and you can bring it back to me, right? So when you're meeting with your donors, when you're having conversations with your donors, you want to make sure that you're always leaving a sweater in the car, and you're always, which means that you're always getting a yes to a next step. And the next step could be something big, and it could be something small, right? So it could be something as big as, will you host a vision meeting at your lovely home? Or it could be something as small as, will you like us on Facebook, right? So what depending on the conversation, depending on the donor, depending on where you are in terms of your engagement plan with this donor, you're going to get yeses to varying levels of next steps, but you have to get a yes to something. And this is how we keep the conversation going. This is how we have, so often when we meet with donors, we have these conversations, and then we kind of just leave it open-ended at the end, and we don't have a specific follow-up that we've gained agreement on. And that's where a lot of us get stuck. That's where a lot of us tend to think about a time when this has happened to you, and then a week later you're sitting at your desk stewing about that meeting and thinking, I'm not quite sure how I'm supposed to follow up with this person. He said this, I think he was interested, and he also didn't really seem like he wanted me to call him soon. And this happens more often than it should, that we have decent, good conversations with donors and then are left without a specific follow-up plan. And this is where our engagement strategies often get stopped, right? This is the roadblock for a lot of us. And we can solve that simply by always getting a yes to a next step and having that thought out. And what I really encourage you to do, and this is where, again, I mentioned this worksheet, and this is one of the resources that I can share with you after the webinar, is having that donor plan in place, having your engagement strategies worked out. And there's also another resource that I can share with you, which is a visit planning worksheet. And it's a worksheet just to plan your visit, which can be really helpful and a great way to decide what obstacles, how you're going to increase motivation, how you're going to decrease objection, what your think, feel, and do messages are going to be in that visit, and what your yes is going to be. What are you going to get them to say yes to? And I really encourage, when you're going into having a conversation with a donor, have a few potential yeses in mind, and have them be kind of varying levels, varying degrees of next steps, because ultimately some of this is going to depend on how your conversation goes, right? So as you're asking your strategic questions, as you're filling in those pieces of the donor puzzle during your conversation, as you're sharing your think, feel, and do messages, you're going to get information which is going to dictate what the appropriate yes is going to be. So have some things in mind. So maybe you have something, again, you think maybe they might be interested in coming up and taking a tour or hosting an event at their home, but maybe you're a little worried that they're not going to be ready to take that big of a next step, so you're going to ask them to do something, a little bit, lower key, lower touch, lower term kind of yes. And again, sometimes it's just a yes to, will you take my call when I call you next? Or, I'm going to have our CEO give you a call in the next couple of weeks. Will you take that call? And just getting a yes to allowing follow-up can be a really significant thing. Just knowing that if you or someone else from your organization does call them, that they'll actually take the call, and they'll actually, take some time to chat with you and have some follow-up is really, really important. So again, if you want to be strategic, if you want to have strategic conversations, you have to have a plan. And that plan cannot be in your head. That plan has to be on a piece of paper or on your computer. It has to be a written plan. So often, especially with conversations, we tend to be better about planning for big things, and we don't always think that we need to have a plan to just have a donor meeting, right? To just have a conversation with a donor or potential donor. And that is why we tend to not do a great job with these things, because we have to have written plans in place. The engagement strategy worksheet that I mentioned is really going to be your overall plan, right? So this is the plan that you're creating for a donor over the course of 3, 6, 9 months, even a year, right? And this is kind of the plan that you're building for them to engage them over a period of time. Whereas the visit planning worksheet that I mentioned is really about the visit, this next conversation that you're going to have with this donor, and making sure that you have all your ducks in a row, that you know what the pieces of the donor puzzle are that need to be solved, that you know what strategic questions you need to ask, and that you're prepared. And, in order for us to enact this, I think, I've talked a lot about what we need to share with donors, in our think and our feel messages, making sure that we have facts and figures, making sure that we have, stories and of impact and how they're helping to have impact on the world and on the community. But ultimately, we need to remember that this needs to be a 30-70 conversation. And you've all heard the statistics about, the percentage that people remember, all of those statistics about, that people only hear a certain amount of what we say, and that they actually only remember a very, very small percentage of what we say, but that people tend to remember almost everything that they say, right? So we as people, we don't always hear others very well, and we don't always retain what others say to us, but we always remember what we say, right? Because we are all wise and witty and smart, and it's very easy to remember the things that we say. So when you're planning this conversation, when you're planning this meeting, it's important to plan a 30-70 conversation. And what I mean by that is that you are going to talk about 30% of the time. And I know that that's hard because traditionally we go in and with enough information to talk 100% of the time. So we have to be sure that we are speaking 30% of the time, and that we are allowing the person that we're having the conversation with to talk 70% of the time. But we want to make sure that what they're saying is relevant to our organization. And this is where having strategic questions comes into play. And again, I reiterate, please email me if you are interested in getting a copy of those strategic questions. Because if we're asking the right questions, then we can be sure that we're getting them to talk about us. So it's not that we want them to talk 70% of the time about random stuff, right? We want them to be talking 70% of the time about things we want to know. So, we need to be making sure that we ask them questions to fill in the donor puzzle. So what are the things that we don't know? What are the things we need answers to? And we also want to get them talking about how great we are, right? Because before I talked about how we can't just sit there and tell them how great we are. And again, if they're not going to remember that much of what we say, but they're going to remember everything that they say, how great if we can get them talking about how great we are. So this really, again, I think is the importance of questions. And Dorothy Leeds and her great book, The 7th Power of Questions, talks about why questions are so important. And again, you can't go into a meeting or go into a conversation thinking that you're going to wing it. And, most of us in development, and I've known a lot of development people over the years, and I'm a development person myself, and most of us consider ourselves to be excellent communicators. I think that's probably something that across, the spectrum of development people, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, most development folks are pretty great communicators, and consider ourselves to be great communicators. And because we consider ourselves to be great communicators, we tend to not prepare that much for communication. And maybe I might be applying some of my own tics to this, but the reality is sometimes when you have strengths, you don't prepare as much in the areas where you're strong, right? You tend to focus on the areas where you aren't as strong. And so this is where, especially for those of you who do consider yourselves to be really great communicators and really great with people, we tend to not plan ahead about how we're going to engage in a conversation. We tend to not think about what questions we're going to ask because we think, I'm a good communicator. I'll be able to go in there and read the room and read the situation and wing it, right? Please don't wing it. And this is coming from the queen of winging it. You know, I mean, I'm all about winging it. And I will tell you that the best way to have a strategic conversation is to be strategic about it and plan ahead. What are the areas of the donor puzzle that we don't know? What questions do we need answered? And what are the questions that we need to ask in order to get those answers? And really think about it. Now, of course, asking questions means that we have to be really good listeners. And so, you know, again, for people like me, and I'll use myself as an example, you know, I'm a great talker. I love to talk, as some of you probably have noticed. You know, I love to share with people. I'm not always the best listener. And if we're going to ask questions, if we're going to be really strategic about the questions that we ask, then we have to be really good at listening. And we have to really think about listening. We have to use all of these layers. We have to use more than one sense, right? Don't just listen with your ears, listen with your eyes, look at body language, listen for, you know, where people have gaps, or where people, you know, maybe are pausing or uncomfortable by a question, and interpret those things that you're hearing, evaluate what people are saying to you. And, you know, we do often tend to assume negatives about that. Don't assume, right? Don't make assumptions when people are sharing information with you. If you're not sure, if you're evaluating that effectively, ask follow-up questions, right? So make sure that you're not making assumptions about what people are telling you. If you're unsure, if you're not positive about how that information is, you know, how you're interpreting that, make sure you're asking follow-up, and then respond. Make sure you're giving verbal feedback. All of us are different kinds of listeners. I love this this list of different types of listeners. I know it's a very hefty slide, but you know, take a look at this, and most of you will kind of look through this and find the one that you are. What I actually tend to find is that most people are more than one of these, that people tend to be, you know, kind of 2 or 3 of these things. But the reason I show it is, you know, a lot of times, you know, when I use this in-person trainings, people kind of love to laugh about, oh gosh, yeah, that's me, oh, how embarrassing. And, you know, I'm the daughter of a psychotherapist, so I am very much of the mind that you know, we all have our faults, we all have our issues, and the first step is just awareness, right? Knowing what our deficiencies are, knowing what our challenges are, and that's the only way that we can really address them. So going through a list like this and finding the things that you identify with, which of these you really feel like you are, and then being able to proactively address it. You know, there's certain things that I know when I'm, you know, my listening challenges, and when I'm having conversations with people, I actively, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking about those things. You know, I tend to be an interrupter, and I catch myself doing it, and when I catch myself doing it, I stop, and you know, as I'm still listening to people, I'm telling myself, don't interrupt, listen, and it's just something that I have to consistently work on. But, you know, in order to work on it, we have to identify where we are. So I encourage you to all think about what some of your listening challenges are and proactively work on them. I want to just finish up again with visit prep, because I think this is just kind of a really practical piece of strategic conversations that we don't talk enough about. You know, again, most of us tend to kind of go into visits, and, you know, usually with a visit we'll do a profile. You know, we'll usually kind of sit down and pull information out of our databases. We'll make sure we know, you know, make sure we review everything we know about the person. We'll look at what their last gift was, and we kind of go into a meeting, and we don't necessarily take the time again to revisit that donor puzzle and figure out what we still don't know about them. We tend to focus just on what we know about people, but not necessarily focus on what we don't know about people. So this is a helpful, as we think about visit prep and we think about getting ready to meet with a donor and have a conversation with the donor, these are kind of the 5 steps that you should be thinking about. So first and foremost, what do we want them to say yes to? What's that next step in their donor plan that we want to, as we move them along the continuum of the Turnpike curve, what's that next step that we're, short-term goal that we're getting them to say yes to? What do we know about them? And of course, what do we not know about them? How do we find out what we don't know? And this is where those strategic questions really come in handy, because we're able to say, okay, so here's the things we need to find out about. Let's refer to the strategic questions. Here are a handful of questions that we're going to have in our back pocket, ready to ask. What do we need to share with them? So we do, as much as this is about getting them to talk, there may be some stuff that we want to go into this meeting prepared with, whether it be a copy of our financials or a copy of our annual report or a video that we just shot at a recent program event or whatever it might be. Are there some things that we want to make sure we're sharing? And then finally, we want to prepare the team, because it's often not just you that's going out and having these visits, but it is a team of people. So how do we make sure that everyone on the team that's going to have this visit, whether it's your CEO or your president or faculty or a board member, whoever it might be that's going with you, that they are comfortable with, this idea of asking strategic questions, that they're prepared to listen really well. So this is kind of your 5-step visit prep that you should go through every time you're getting ready to have a conversation with a donor. And then finally, closing the loop, because this is something, not many of you in the poll noted that you have a challenge with this, but this is something that I tend to see with visits that is a challenge for a lot of organizations, which is making sure that you record the information when you're done. Because ultimately, if you go out and you have a really great visit and you ask some really great questions and you get some really great information back from people, but you don't record it anywhere except in your mind, then that's a challenge, and that's going to get you in trouble down the road. So ultimately, if you're going to make an effort to have more strategic conversations, that means that you're going to be collecting more data and more information about your donors, which means that you need to record it somewhere. So, just make sure that you're closing that visit loop, that you're collecting the information, it's getting written down somewhere, and that it's ultimately getting put into your database or whatever it is where you keep your donor information. Hopefully for all of you, or for most of you, it is some kind of database that you're keeping that information in, but making sure you're collecting it and you're recording. This is especially important if you're sending board members or faculty or CEOs or program staff or whoever it might be. If you're sending non-development staff out to have these visits, this is a really critical piece of the loop to make sure that you have closed. Make sure you have systems and mechanisms in place so that people can record what they learn in those visits and can share it back with the development team to get put back into your development systems. And then analyze that and plan all over again, right? So you're going to collect the information, you're going to record it, it's going to go into your systems, you're going to look and you're going to revisit that donor puzzle to say, okay, so we learned some pieces of the donor puzzle. It looks like we still have a couple of things we're not sure about before we're ready to make that big ask. So maybe, next time we need to make sure that we answer these next handful of questions, and we start that planning process all over again. And we just continue to go through that process until we feel like we have answered the donor puzzle, we're ready to make the appropriate ask, and ready to continue to steward and engage these donors, hopefully in perpetuity. So that's really the biggest piece. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. I do encourage all of you to please get in touch with me. I do really want to apologize again for all of the technical difficulties we had today. As I mentioned, we did just switch platforms, and there were just a couple of new buttons that I didn't realize I had to push with different things. So I am really, really sorry about that. I hope you all enjoyed the webinar. anyway, and I hope you all got some good information today. Just a reminder, the 3 resources that I mentioned today, the engagement strategy worksheet, the visit planning worksheet, and the strategic questions resource. If you're interested in getting any of those resources, please email me at lmccombs@theosborngroup.com. I'm also happy to share a PDF of the slides from today, and I will have a recording, although with all of our technical difficulties, not sure how helpful that is, but I will have a recording of this available on my YouTube channel as well. So thank you all for joining me today. Again, sorry for the technical difficulties. I hope you'll reach out and get some of those worksheets, and I hope you will join me again on a future webinar with the Osborne Group. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day.